Remember, evolution doesn't happen in one lifetime. Evolution happens over generations of a population in a population. So we can witness drug resistance in bacteria through many, many generations. Insecticide resistance. So what farmers will do is they spray their crops with insecticides to prevent the bugs from eating the crops. Well, those bugs, over many generations, develop a resistance to the insecticide, and over time, the insecticide becomes non-effective, just like antibiotics. As bacteria build resistance to drugs, antibiotics become ineffective at treating the disease caused by the bacteria. England's peppered moss is another example of observed evolution. So this is bacteria. These are England's peppered moss. So what happened with England's peppered moss is they started out, as you can see in the top picture, being white. And what this did is it helped them to blend into the bark on the trees. Well, then the Industrial Revolution happened, and England became very, very polluted from all of the factories. And because of the pollution, the bark on the trees became darker from all of the soot. So the moths that were white were the moths that were actually being ate as lunch because the white stood out against the black on the bark. The peppered moths that were naturally black were originally a minority because they could be easily seen, so they were eaten as lunch. After the Industrial Revolution, when the trees became so covered in soot that the tree bark actually looked dark, the pepper moths that were white were the ones that became lunch, and the ones that were dark were the ones that were better camouflaged. So the dark-colored moths actually began to dominate the population until after the Industrial Revolution. After the Industrial Revolution, England actually began to clean up its pollution problem, and the bark of the trees was no longer covered in soot. So once again, the moths that were black were more easily seen, and the moths that were black became lunch. The moths that were white were better camouflaged, and they were the ones that survived. So how does evolution actually occur? Well, there were some early theories about it. One of the first early theories was presented by Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. He was one of the first scientists to recognize that living things are changing over time. So some of the early theories used by Lamarck were the idea that it's a desire to change that causes evolution. So organisms change because they have an inborn urge to better themselves. So birds developed wings because they really, really wanted to fly. Seems silly to us because we want to fly so badly that we invented planes. But we couldn't grow wings. And then use and disuse. So organisms can alter their shape by using their bodies in new ways. So organs would increase in size if they were used a lot and vice versa. Well, one way to think about this is muscles. If you go to the gym and you work out every day and you develop these huge muscles, does that mean that your children are going to have huge muscles? No. Your children also are going to have to go to the gym to develop these huge muscles. And then passing on acquired traits. So acquired characteristics are passed on to future generations. So just like I said about the muscles, just because you develop muscles in your lifetime doesn't mean that your children are going to be born with big muscles. They're going to have to go to the gym and develop their own muscles. So the major idea behind evolution is that evolution doesn't happen in just one lifetime. You can't change your body and then that change the physical characteristics that your children will have. Evolution occurs over many, many, many generations, over thousands and millions of years, not within one lifetime. So Charles Darwin was the scientist who came up with the ideas for evolution that are most widely accepted in the scientific community today. in Christmas of 1831, he set sail on the Beagle for a 5-year cruise around the world. He was quite a young man at that time. And while he was on that cruise, he was making some observations, collecting data, forming hypotheses, and analysis of the data that he collected remains the foundation for evolutionary theory today. So he did some very important work that he published in his book, Origin of Species. And here he is as an old man, and this map is showing you his voyage around the world, his 5-year voyage on the Beagle. Obviously, his most famous stop is the Galapagos. It's the stop that we all know the most about. And the reason why it's so famous is he was able to see a large variety of organisms that were demonstrating some very clear examples of evolution. So, for instance, he saw these finches. He saw lots and lots of different species of finches that all had different shaped beaks. And the shape of the beak was dependent upon the food that the finch was eating. Theory of natural selection. Natural selection is the process by which the organisms whose characteristics are well suited for the environment survive and reproduce. So for organisms, it's all about sex. It's all about being able to live long enough to reproduce and pass on those genes. So if your genes allow you to be well adapted to your environment, you're going to live long enough to find a mate, to reproduce, and pass on those genes. And that's a good thing because those genes are obviously favorable because they're allowing an organism to be well adapted to its environment. So there are 3 steps to natural selection, and the first step is variations. So genes mutate. And what this means is in DNA, something changes, or RNA doesn't read DNA the way that it should be read, so a different type of protein gets made. So the way it works is DNA is this molecule that contains our genes, and DNA gets read by RNA. RNA tells the body to make a protein. Well, if DNA gets damaged, or if it gets misread by the RNA, then a different protein gets made. And what that does is it causes a different physical feature to develop. That physical feature can either be a disadvantage, which will cause an organism to not survive long enough and reproduce, which will then get rid of the genetic mutation, or the genetic mutation will cause a physical feature to develop, which allows an organism to be even better suited for its environment so that it lives long enough to reproduce multiple times and pass on genes to more offspring, which increases the chances of that genetic mutation continuing to be passed on through the generations. So what this is doing is providing genetic variation. This is why sexual reproduction is so important for natural selection, because in sexual reproduction, different genes are being mixed and recombined to make new physical features. So in this picture, we have the giraffe with a long neck and a giraffe with a short neck. So the giraffe with the long neck has genes that are coding for that long neck. The giraffe with the short neck has genes that is coding for a short neck. So this is variation. So which of these 2 is most likely to survive? Well, the one with the long neck, because it can reach the leaves in order to get the energy that it needs in order to survive. One of the characteristics of living organisms, obtaining energy, growing, and developing. Selection is the struggle for existence, and organisms either survive and reproduce or they don't. So far more organisms are born than ever grow to adulthood. And this used to be true for humans as well. Back in the day when there weren't the medical technologies that we have today, it was not uncommon for babies to die very early in their life. It was not uncommon for children to die of what we consider to be common illnesses today. And this was part of the reason why human beings were having 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 children, because it wasn't uncommon for a couple to have a dozen children and maybe only 3 or 4 of them actually survived to adulthood because they didn't have the medical medical advances that we have today. So organisms with adaptations well suited to the environment are selected to survive. So with humans, before medical advances, the offspring that had the strongest immune systems to fight off these diseases and recover from the diseases, those are the ones that were going to live long enough to reproduce. So that giraffe with the short neck, well, it wasn't suited for its environment. It wasn't selected, so it died before it could pass on its genes. It's natural selection. And then finally is reproduction. So the best fit organisms have the highest probability of successfully reproducing because they're going to be able to live long enough to find a mate, to obtain all the energy that they need, and to reproduce. So favorable characteristics known as adaptions will then be passed on to the offspring. Organisms in future generations will become better and better adapted to their environment as those genes are passed from one offspring to the next. So the giraffe that has the genes coding for a longer neck is going to be the giraffe that survives, reproduces, and passes on those genes to the next generation. It might seem cruel, but that's nature, that's natural selection. And evolutionary fitness. So in summary, each time an organism reproduces, it's passing on copies of its genes to the offspring, including genetic mutations. And as I mentioned before, genetic mutations can either be beneficial and help an organism to be better adapted, or the genetic mutation might cause the organism to not be well adapted to its environment, and it will that organism will die before it has a chance to reproduce. So evolutionary fitness is the success an organism has in passing on its genes to the next generation. So the more that an organism is reproducing, the more of its genes it is passing on to the next generation, and the more likely those genes will be passed on to future generations. So evolution occurs only if genes are passed on and measured in future generations, and they're measured in the physical adaptations that help an organism to be best adapted to its environment. So, for instance, zebra stripes, we think, may act as camouflage to help them not become lunch, so that they can live long enough to reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation. Camouflage, as used by these moths, is used so that they're not easily seen by predators, so that they can live long enough to reproduce and pass their genes on to the next generation. They're considered to be evolutionary fit. All right, so that is some evidence supporting the idea of evolution.